church us or at university. It's been a long day. I'm glad you're here. And people are going to trickle in throughout the evening, and that's okay. Just know that people are getting here as they can. And I know some folks are having some trouble getting here on time because they're dropping kids off and our children's stuff that's across the street. So anyway, we'll be in flux. Let me invite you, even if you've been here before and you filled out a note card, please fill out another one. There are note cards on your tables. If you'll write your name and your contact information on that, an email is probably best, but an email and a phone number are great. And then I'm just going to invite you to keep that note card with you throughout the evening, because there may be questions that you want to write down, or there may be things that you want to remember or let me know about. At the end of the evening, I'll collect all those note cards. You can just leave them on the table, and I'll get them at the end of the evening. But if there's anything in the evening that you want some follow-up with, or just anything you want me to know, it's helpful for you to use that note card. Tonight our topic is trauma. So it's not going to be, if you came here to have a kind of sunshine and Skittles evening, let me invite you to maybe find another Bible study. As somebody asked me, should we come? And I said, yeah. And they said, I just want you to make sure that you know that we're going to talk a lot about Good Friday. We'll end up at Easter, but we're going to be honest about the Good Fridays in our lives, and that's going to be true tonight. So, as always, let me let you know a few things. There are lots of handouts in the back, lots of pamphlets and forms. There is a copy of the PowerPoint that Dr. Kevin Pernicano did last week. If you were here last week and you wanted a copy of that PowerPoint, it's in the back. And there's also a copy tonight of Dr. Pat Pernicano's presentation that can also be very helpful. So you may want to pick that up as well. Let me introduce our mental health initiative team. They're mostly here and some back there. If you'll raise your hand if you've been on the group that's helped plan these days. Dr. Steve Welch, who is our church counselor in the back. And then this group of folk here are all mental health professionals are working in the mental health area. And our speaker tonight is Reverend Denise Barker. And I'll tell you more about her when we get ready to introduce her. But let me start with prayer. Let's open with prayer. Lord, thank you for calling us each to this space here tonight. Use our time in ways that lead us to truth. And let the truth that we find be truth that sets us free. That's the promise we have in you, Lord, and we lean into that promise tonight. So I pray that you are with each and every one of us, and the things that we hear and the things that we learn, let them all lead us closer to you. It's in Christ that we pray. Amen. Amen. So why are we talking about this? It's not a sunshine and Skittles topic. But it's an important topic. It is a part of many people's lives that they experience trauma in one way or another. And we know that trauma can lead us to have kind of broken things in our lives. We're talking about trauma tonight because God cares wherever God's people are broken. God's heart is. I had a seminary professor that used to make me so mad. He would always say, if you want to see where Jesus is, go where it hurts. And he always meant places where there was poverty, and he's right about that. But God, if you want to see Jesus go where it hurts, he's also talking about in the broken hearts of God's people. Which that happens in trauma, and so that's why we're talking about it. As most of you know, we did a mental health survey last year, and what came out of that survey were the top 5 things that you people in the congregation are dealing with. Anxiety and depression, which we're going to get to toward the end of this 6 weeks. Addiction and substance abuse, which we will get to next week. And trauma. Adult survivors of abuse. And I think that's it. So many of those things go together. Many people will have one, not just one of those lists, but several of those lists. And so we're going to talk about it. I don't know if anybody's here from the, there's a group that meets, a PTSD support group that meets here on Wednesday nights. If you're here from that group, we welcome you, and we're glad all of you are here. Some of you are here because you've lived through trauma. Some of you are here because you love somebody that's lived through trauma. And some of you are here because you're good church folk who want to know, how do I be a better Christian to the people in my congregation and in the pews, in the chairs each week, to love them in a way that can bring wholeness and healing. I'm glad you're all here. So I'm going to stop talking now and kick it off to Dr. Pat Parnacano, who is going to lead us through the kind of clinical aspects, the clinical information about trauma, what it is, different treatments. And so, Pat, welcome, welcome and thank you.
It's Velcro to the spot.
So let's see, a good place for me might be like right about here, then I can see everybody.
Oh, Pat, before you start that.
I already started.
There was one thing I wanted to say. You may have questions. What I'd like you to do is save them till the very end. I want to make sure we get through all the material we want to cover, and in our program time, we have built-in time, a substantial time for question and answer in this large group, as well as question time at the end. If you want to come and have one-on-one conversations with us, that time is built in as well. So that's kind of harsh. I may say wait on your questions, but I just want to make sure we have enough time to get through the information. So if you'll kind of abide by that, I'd appreciate it.
So my piece is to tell everybody, talk a little bit about what we mean by saying trauma. And then when someone goes through a trauma, what are some of the possible things that happen after that trauma? Now, everything we're talking about this week, next week, there's always a continuum. We call it the stress continuum for trauma, because there's going to be some upset. Every human being is going to have some reaction to trauma when you go through it. But it's not always PTSD. Sometimes it's other kinds of symptoms. Sometimes there's immediate upset and someone gets better pretty quickly. So individuals are different how they react to trauma. There we go. We all try to adapt. We're made, God makes us human beings who try to cope with what we go through. So after we go through something really difficult, we try to adapt to the stressful circumstance. And our coping can be from manageable to traumatic symptoms, and our stress can range from low to high intensity, from brief to long-lasting. We call it chronic trauma. There's a word they use called complex trauma, which means you had a whole bunch of different traumatic events, maybe starting in childhood, and one gets layered upon another. So whether you have a bad reaction to trauma or develop PTSD, it depends on what you went through. It depends on what resources you had to cope at the time. And it depends on kind of your whole environment that you're living in. So there's a lot of different kinds of traumatic events. Now I want to define for you, if you look at a diagnostic manual, you know, we have to diagnose PTSD when we work with that. Well, a trauma is a threatening, very stressful event. It can be witnessed or experienced. Like if you saw someone you knew killed in a car accident, or you witnessed a traumatic accident, you might develop trauma symptoms from seeing that, even though you weren't in the accident. It often involves overwhelming threats to life, to well-being, to bodily integrity. You tend to result with fear. You have fear in the moment. and you feel very helpless. So trauma combines a really terrible event, something you didn't have any control over, and it was fearful, scary, it endangered you or someone else close to you. So these kinds of things can all result in traumatic response. A severe motor vehicle accident, first responders, they come upon lots of traumatic events, especially ones that involve children. There's a lot of stress involved coping with those kinds of things. Combat exposure is a form of trauma. Child abuse is a form of trauma. So is domestic violence. Natural disasters, the hurricane, tsunami, different kinds of natural disasters present people with traumatic exposure. I had a motor vehicle accident, 2008, 10 years ago. And when I conjure it up, it's just like yesterday. I mean, it's, you know how that is. If you go through a traumatic event, it's like, if you get a picture of it, you're right back there. And in my accident, I didn't get severely injured, but I could have died. A guy hit me from behind. It was rush hour. It was raining, and he was going about 75, 80 miles an hour, and he was a UPS overnight worker who fell asleep at the wheel. So I didn't see him coming. I'm just driving to work trying to stay awake. And all of a sudden there was a bang, and my car spun out. I went across the median. I went up on the wrong side of the highway on the other side, and it's pouring rain, and all I see is a semi and two cars way up in the distance. I remember a faint, oh shit, I'm gonna die. So. And then I remember, God help me get off this road. Very quickly, I got back to the median, stopped the car, and then I fell apart. You know, the guy that hit me, he ran across 4 lanes of traffic in the rain to check on me, and we looked where I had just been. There was muddy car tracks for about 100 yards, and he looked at me and I looked at him, because now there was no break in traffic. Like just, what, 2 minutes later, and it was wall-to-wall traffic. So, you know, that incident was traumatic for me, and it led me to growth and change in my life, because it was kind of a wake-up call. It was like, okay, God, you didn't take me today, so what do you have for me to do for the rest of my life, you know? So that's what I did with it, and it hasn't stayed with me in the way that if you don't get help or resolution, that trauma can really result in long-lasting symptoms. Here's some other typical trauma that cause PTSD: prolonged captivity, torture, school shootings, mass shootings, genocide, sexual trafficking, physical assault, sexual assault. Those are some high-risk events. Those at highest risk, if we look at statistics, it's victims of violent crimes, it's members of the armed forces, police, journalists, prison service, fire service, ambulance, and emergency personnel, those who help others come upon traumatic events. Victims of war, torture, terrorism, and refugees, survivors of accidents and disasters. Women who have traumatic childbirth have a high rate of PTSD.
Whose childbirth isn't traumatic?
Well, yeah, okay, okay. And unusually, well, like there's a woman someone's working with right now where I work, and they just found out, and she's probably 30 weeks, they just found out that the baby's not going to live because 3/4 of the brain is outside the skull. And so she's carried the baby, she's got to carry it to term, and they know the baby's going to die soon after birth. That's going to be traumatic. And they're already starting to deal with their 4-year-old who says, when is my baby brother coming? So it's a family trauma. We have that too. Now, with regard to what kind of symptoms someone might develop after a traumatic event, you might have normal coping. That means you have a spurt of strong emotion. You have some very brief, maybe sleep problems or mood problems, but you gradually get back to normal. Usually within a month or so, you get back to normal. You might, though, develop an adjustment disorder after a traumatic event, or you might develop a stress disorder, an acute stress disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. I'll tell you a little bit about those. Normal coping is brief, mild symptoms. They don't interfere with your functioning. That's kind of one of our lingos for, okay, you can go to work, you can think, you can sleep, and you don't get a divorce over it. You know, you stay married. So it's not like causing great disruption in your life. You might have emotional distress, like worry, I'm sad, I'm crying a lot, I'm tearful, I'm really tired all the time, I can't concentrate. Those are normal, adaptive ways that we cope to recover from a traumatic event. Most of those issues resolve without professional help, and the person may benefit from, calming activities, from supports, from friends, from meditation, from nature, music. Lots of things can help us recenter, and calm back down. If we develop an adjustment disorder, then we have a reaction that might last up to 3 months. And in that 3-month period, you do notice a change in your functioning, and so do people around you. You might have a depressed mood that lasts up to 3 months. You might have lower energy, higher fatigue, real confused thinking. You feel like you're off in a fog all the time. And you don't have symptoms quite to the level of a stress disorder, like a PTSD. And every diagnosis has its own criteria. So this is sort of the mid-level, but mild, and usually clears up in a few months. Person might benefit from supportive counseling, taking good care of yourself, getting some pastoral care. Sometimes people will take short-term medication, something a little to help with sleep. Sleep is really important. It's not a good idea to develop sleep deprivation. It's one of the highest risks of suicide in the elderly when they go through a hard time and they can't sleep. So you want to be able to sleep, have an adequate appetite, get a little exercise, and be able to leave the house and carry out your routine. Now, once you get past the point of that, you might develop symptoms of PTSD. Symptoms of PTSD can be acute, which means 3 days to 1 month after the traumatic event. And the acute stress, about 19% of the people that go through a traumatic event develop, PTSD symptoms that are short-lasting. Vehicle accidents, 13 to 21%. I fell in that category. After my car accident, I had a short-term, anxious reaction. I hated driving in the rain. I still do. And San Antonio certainly has challenged my comfort level behind the wheel, because the traffic here is like nothing we've ever seen. 14% have a PTSD reaction after a brain injury, 24% after an assault, like a mugging or a physical assault, and 59% after rape. Rape is the most high-risk cause of PTSD. Now, there's other kind of problems that are more likely to create post-traumatic stress, not just a short-term stress reaction. we kind of recommend that if somebody is having symptoms that rise to the level of PTSD, because ASD is PTSD but shorter lasting. And with some help, it'll clear up. If it doesn't clear up, it just automatically converts to a PTSD diagnosis after that short period of time. After a trauma, people should not take benzodiazepines like Valium or Xanax. Those are contraindicated in the brain for trauma. And CBT, cognitive behavioral treatment, helps. Propranolol, various serotonin medications, they're like Zoloft, Prozac, Paxil. They're very good for trauma symptoms. Symptoms of PTSD are the highest level symptoms. Usually people are re-experiencing their abuse. They have images or memories of the trauma that pop into their head when they don't want to think about it. They're not like sitting and ruminating on it. It just sort of pops up and gets them really upset. They might have sensory memories. Rape victims often have really bad triggers around touch or around seeing someone that looks a lot like the person that hurt them. Any kind of a trigger that resembles the situation can really unnerve you. Like my, veterans will say, a loud noise, boy, some are ready to hit the floor because it's so activating. It sounds like an explosion. It sounds like a bomb. And so I hear from vets, they see trash on the side of the road and it feels like they're going to hit an IED. So, our brains don't know the difference between what's real and what's similar. So a loud noise for me with rain tells me someone's going to hit me. And I have to kind of like, okay, calm down. This is just San Antonio traffic in the rain. Persistent avoidance of things that remind them of the trauma. So someone who's been assaulted might stay home too much and not go out anymore. They might be afraid of walking alone. They might be afraid of being around people of sex that hurt them if they've been assaulted. People that lost a baby traumatically hate to be around other people with children. Makes them cry. It's not just a bereavement, it's a traumatic loss under some conditions. People will avoid activities. They can't watch certain TV shows or movies because all of a sudden a scene will come that reminds them of the trauma and they kind of black out and go there and then they're really upset. They might leave the room, they might leave the house. There's a persistently increased arousal, which just means you're really hyper. Your adrenaline is up. Your whole nervous system is keyed up. So you have trouble with a startle. You have trouble concentrating. You might have anger outbursts or get really irritable. You might have trouble with sleep. That's a common symptom after a traumatic event. And you might be kind of, hyperactive, agitated, like bounce your knee a lot, and you didn't do it before. So you're all worked up. Your whole nervous system has changed. Most people experience at least one traumatic event in their life. Not all develop a disorder. Like I said before, there's like a certain kind of normal adjustment period. About 7.8% of people that go through a traumatic event develop PTSD. There's a higher risk from intentional violence, like on purpose, right, than there is from accidents or disasters. Men have more traumatic events, like off that list I read to you, but women have more of those high impact events, like rape and assault. Women are more at risk of PTSD symptoms. The highest impact event is rape. And high impact events include war, combat, childhood neglect and abuse, kidnapping, being threatened with a weapon, being tortured, survivors of the Holocaust, prisoners of war. There's lower rates, but still some PTSD in accidents, witnessing death or injury, fire, living through a terrible fire, or a natural disaster. I want you to see that when you go through a traumatic event, really severe trauma or chronic trauma, like one after another, it changes the brain. So one of the reasons we get symptoms is there's changes in our brain. I want to thank Dr. Bremner of Emory for the slides that follow. It's a visual. You can see that non-stress nerve on the left? See all those nice connections, right? On the right is the lack of connections in a nerve cell where there's been acute stress and trauma. The verbal memory function in twins, with and without PTSD. Look at the big difference in memory. You see the bars here, memory deficits in women with abuse-related PTSD. You see how it bounces up, and the non-abuse, non-PTSD have the best memories. So when people have had a trauma and they say, I can't remember anything, I have to make lists. I can't focus, I go in the other room. It's true, the hippocampus, the part of the brain that's involved in memory, actually loses cells. And then as people go into treatment and get better, it grows new cells. That's what Dr. Bremner's work has shown. It's hopeful. And here's the hippocampus volume. That's that part of the brain that remembers things and can process, think your way through things. It's a whole lot smaller in abused people with PTSD, also in abused people without PTSD. So I thank him for his visuals, because they're really telling. So recovery, you know, the hope is there's a high rate of recovery, even without treatment, in the first year after a trauma. What that says is if you go through a really traumatic event, you need to surround yourself with supports. You need to do calming, relaxing activities, self-care, connect with a pastor or a friend, talk about it. We do have a lot of evidence that if you start avoiding things and you don't talk about it, you get worse. It's really good to talk about it. And there's lots of treatments that contribute to getting over PTSD. You know, you can re-engage with people, you can process the event, you can do mindfulness and meditation. There's a specialized treatment called cognitive processing therapy that's very helpful for PTSD. It's evidence-based. And there's a lot of therapy techniques used to help people resolve trauma symptoms. EMDR can be helpful. There's complex integrative therapy. There's medication. There's domestic violence support groups in most areas. That's very helpful because you're not alone. And veteran support groups too, where you start talking about it and you realize you're not alone. And you get better by sharing your stories with others. So any treatment you get, you know, because who says they're all good? Those are all good evidence-based things. But any good trauma treatment is going to include these elements. It's going to offer you education about trauma. It's going to help you with relaxation and stress management. It's going to help you manage your moods. It's going to help you cope with your thoughts that develop after the trauma. You're going to tell your story. That's what trauma narrative is. You're going to have in vivo exposure, which just means you're going to go do things that you've been avoiding doing. Your therapist is going to help you do that. You're going to have sessions maybe with your spouse or your family to to be able to talk about a trauma that's affected your whole family. And then you're going to talk about safety, especially if you were injured, hurt, or assaulted. All right, I think that's it. All right, thank you.
Making sure I turn that off for just a second. Okay, thank you, Dr. Mack. We appreciate your wisdom, and there will be time for you to ask some questions at the end. One of the things that Pat said that I think is super important for us to grab as the community of the church is that she said something like we get better by telling our stories. We get better when we are able to tell our stories, and I think we get better when we're able to hear each other's stories, which is why we have included in every one of our Starting the Conversation evenings a time of testimony, of someone sharing their story. And tonight we're blessed, truly blessed, to invite one of our own back home, Denise Barker. Reverend Denise Barker is going to share with us. And this is your church home, yes? This is your home. So welcome home, Denise, and thank you for sharing. Yeah, you can clap for her now. As we talked last week, the same is true today. The things that we're talking about are pressing buttons for people in the room. Some of you in this room have experienced trauma. Some of the things that you're going to hear, especially in the testimony, are going to press some buttons. And so, it's important that we come to this time in a sacred way. And what we did last week, I think, was the right way to do this. Is to say what we say sometimes when we pray in more formal settings. The leader will say, "The Lord be with you," and he will say, "The Lord be also with you." So we're going to do that again. Denise, you're going to receive that.
Get the crying out of the way.
That's okay. So
I'll be
Denise,
okay. If I wore mascara, that would be
okay. So the Lord be with you all in this room.
And also with you.
Be with us now, Lord, and help us to hear the sacred experience of Denise in a way that can lead to healing, hope, and health. Give her courage, give her strength, and let her know that she is home. It's in Christ that we pray.
Amen. Well, I am, first of all, honored to be here in this place that really was a place that gave birth to me as a woman, as an adult. Not only as a woman, but as a pastor in the church. And I was a part of this community actively for about 20 years. And so it's really nice to be here tonight. I'm going to talk about a trauma that I experienced, and I'm not a clinician. I'm a pastor, which means I'm not a clinician. That's right. That's right. I know that. I know my strengths and my weaknesses. And I also run a women's shelter, which means I'm not a clinician. I just know how to start a women's shelter. I started out as an engineer, but I'll talk a little about that. I'm just going to jump right to it. And everyone in here is an adult, and so I'm going to share some things that I've shared lots of times, but they're never easy to say out loud to a room. But I was a gregarious young girl. I was an athlete. I was really quite a scholar and homecoming queen, all that kind of stuff. I mean, I had sort of this Pollyanna life, and I was an exchange student when I was 14. I turned 15 while I was there in Italy. And I was lived outside of Chicago in a town that we had this big high school exchange program, and I went to Italy and lived in Florence with a family. And so I was living there, and they were a very wealthy family and had these beautiful homes. It was unbelievable to me. I spoke Spanish, and so I could sort of understand a little bit of Italian, but for the most part, I didn't know the language. And so they had this big party one night, and there was a man that was there, and he got, I can't really remember how it happened, but he got me in a place where there was no people, and he raped me in this home. And it was a violent rape, a sodomized, and then there was a gun involved, and I was going to be killed if I told anybody when I was in Italy, and I had to stay there. This man would come back to be with the family. And I remember having to get on a boat with him, and he pulled a gun. He had a gun in his little bag, what do you call it, waffle bag or something. And so it was, and I had to live there. I stayed in this in Italy another 4 or 5 months, and this person would be around, and it was awful, right? You know, I had physical things that had happened to me as a result of being sodomized, and but I couldn't tell anyone. I was afraid to tell anyone, you know, and nobody spoke English, and I was so far from my family. I was young, and so when I got back home, I don't remember much, but I know when I got back home, I remember sitting on my couch, right when I'd gotten flown back home, my mom asked me, she goes, "What's wrong with you? Are you okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, yeah. What's wrong? What do you mean? It was a hard trip, whatever." And that's the only thing that was ever said. And I don't know when or how it happened, but I buried the experience. And some of the things that were mentioned, I did. And so I buried this experience, and I think I kind of became a different person. I became very promiscuous. And I sort of lost who I was, I know, and I can look back now and see it. I didn't see it when I was going through it. I became a very insecure girl in college. I was smart. That's the only thing I had going for me at the time. I was a smart girl, and so I was an engineer. I did really well in school. I got a great job. And so from the outside, I looked like this, this is in the 70s, this is like back in the day, girls weren't engineers. And so I was like, oh, she's got it going on, but in the meantime, I was sleeping around, everywhere. I was just like, I got into drugs, I got into alcohol, and so I was kind of a mess. And it wasn't how my mom raised me. I wasn't raised like that. I wasn't like that before. And so, but I really didn't connect it because I didn't even remember I had been raped. And so I moved to Philadelphia. I was working at a nuclear power plant, and during that time, I got engaged to another engineer. And I remember, in the beginning, I was able to be romantic with him, and then pretty soon I wouldn't let him touch me. I mean, not even touch me. I couldn't have him hug me. I would just get the chills, and I would just sort of freak out, especially if he came up behind me. I just remember I had all these things. I didn't want to kiss me. He's like, "Hey, we're supposed to be getting married. You're going to have to work on this." What? Yeah, there's no problem here, I'm like, and so I said, okay, I'll go. My parents lived overseas. I lived in Saudi Arabia, so I wasn't with any family members. I was just working at this plant, and so I called this counselor, who's a Jewish man, and I went there, and I just told him, I said, I don't know, my fiance's got a problem with how I'm acting, I don't want to kiss him, and I think, maybe I just don't love him, I don't know, so anyway, so I started working, so he worked with me for about 6 months, and in the process of this, there was this moment where I remembered the rape, and it was just terrible, right? And so I remember the visuals. I can tell you what the room looked like. I can just sort of tell you the space, And I remember the bathroom because I'd have to go to the bathroom. Too much information, and so I just remembered it, and so we worked a little bit longer, and like a couple months, and then I said, I'm breaking off this engagement. I don't think can marry this man because I'm a mess. I'm not going to marry him, and I moved back to Houston. I was working for Bechtel Engineering, so I moved back and worked in the petrochemical industry and started. He just promised me to go see a counselor. Promised me. I said, yeah, I'm good. I'm good. I'm done. We're done. 6 months. Check. Done. I'm healed. And so, well, I wasn't yet. But so I started working in Houston. My lifestyle didn't change. I was kind of a mess, and then I met this guy that he was a pretty cool guy, and I thought, well, I knew him before I'd left. I'd lived in Houston before, and I knew him when I got back too, and I called him up, and we got together, and pretty soon we were engaged. So I just jumped to the next guy, and he had a good job, and so I was getting engaged. And I remember praying, though. I remember at the altar. I remember we did a prayer, and I was 30 when I got married, and I said, God, please don't let me screw this up. Please, I will do anything for you if you won't let me screw up this relationship. Because I was just like a hurricane going through relationships with guys, and please don't let me screw it up, and I'll do anything you want, And so, we got married, everything went along rosy. We had 2 children. They were great, but intimacy was an issue. I was very amorous, to get this guy to marry me, right? I was like, yeah, let's get married. And then it's like, bam, if he would even come up behind me, I would just about go through the ceiling. I couldn't sleep with my back to him, and I was hyper vigilant was the word. I still have a little bit of those tendencies, But I would never tell him about the rape, because if he knew about the rape, he might leave me. That's what I thought. I thought he'll just think that I'm just that kind of girl and that I deserved it. Or, I mean, there's all these irrational thoughts, like you judge yourself so harshly. And so I would never tell him what was wrong with me, why I was having trouble with intimacy, right? And so intimacy was a huge issue for me. Outbursts of anger, were a huge issue. And so I didn't go to counseling or anything. I still thought I had this figured out. And so then, fast forward, I moved to San Antonio, right? And then when I was in Houston, God had put this call on my life. And I'd even started seminary. We had moved to Pittsburgh. My husband was a doctor. He was in medical school. And so I thought, well, I'll just, maybe I'm supposed to do something for God. I talked to the Jewish man about God. And like, maybe the reason I needed to go to counseling is so I could talk about God, That's what this is all about. Because, maybe God's calling me to do something for him. So I had started that process, right? I had started seminary in Pittsburgh, moved to San Antonio, joined university, and went on staff at the church, and this calling would never go away. And so in the meantime, I'm just sort of wandering through life, intimacy issues, a little bit of anger issues, but I hadn't dealt with the rape at all. And I remember when I started exploring a call to ministry, I could never get past it. It took me 7 years. And the reason it took me 7 years is because I never felt like I was worthy, right? I had all these theological tutors and mentors, and every conversation was the same until finally this one mentor of mine, Gina Campbell, she's like, I am so sick of hearing you say this, Denise. You are just, the opposite of pride is self-defamation. I mean, if you're just as bad as someone who's prideful. If you don't think God can fix you, then you don't understand who God is. And it's the first time someone sort of put that in my face, and so I started thinking, oh, maybe I should talk to someone, but I didn't. I didn't. And so then I was in seminary. I'm healthy, I'm a healthy person. And so I went to seminary, and when I was in seminary, I always had spiritual directors. I had a spiritual. She was a former nun, and she was up in Austin. I was working with her, and one day, she told me, she said, Denise, I want you to explore different kinds of prayer. This time I was like in my late 30s, right? Early 40s, and still hadn't worked on this, right? And so I explored these, I want you to explore. So I really felt called to pray prostrate, right? Because this is a form of prayer in Judaism, and the Wailing Wall, and it showed my humility to God. I wanted to pray facing down. And so I was in my living room. Nobody else was even home in my house. And I lived in Castle Hills. I can remember it. And I laid down, and I couldn't do it. I'm like, what is wrong with me? Like I'm laying down. I was like having an attack, kind of like I couldn't do it. I couldn't because I was back with the elbows. And so I was like having this I don't know what you asked them what you call it, but I was like freaking out. I was freaking out, and I went back and she said, "Okay, tell me about yours." So I didn't do it. So she said, "Tell me about your experience." And I said, I tried some things that didn't work. She said, "Well, tell me why didn't it work?" And so then I had to explain it to her, and tell her about it. She said, "Well, why couldn't you do that?" I said, "Well, I think that was because I was raped, and I just couldn't do it. I was nervous." And she's like. She said, you have got to go talk to someone. You can't, you're in seminary. You've got to go talk to someone. I'm like, well, okay. She says, I have a name for her. She's an art therapist. She's in San Antonio. Her name is Vicki Williams-Patterson. I recommend her to anybody. And so she was a Christian therapist and she did art therapy. And so she says, you're a creative type. I want you to go see her, please. Promise me. And so I started this journey with her, and I'd been on staff at the church all these years. I was director of outreach. I had passion for all these women's issues, and I just couldn't put all the parts together, right? I was just like, I knew this has happened to me, and probably that's why I love helping women and supporting women and being an advocate for them. But I wasn't even an advocate for myself yet, and I hadn't taken care. I hadn't done the self-care I needed to do. And so when I began going to the spiritual director. This counselor, it was just a powerful thing, and I went once a week for 6 months, every week, and then I went every other week for a few months, and then I finally went once a week, once a month. And so that's really where some powerful work happened. And there's more to my story, and you're going to have to give me a time. You're good? Okay, because I haven't talked over it. I've gotten over that if you're talking. So I started doing this work, and I don't know about all the different things she might have tried with me. She didn't probably use the big words with me, but I remember she did some work with hypnosis because I had such strong visuals of the experience, and I would go and pray different places, and she would try to replace one of the things that she did was to try to replace the power that visual of being the act of being thought minds. Replace it with another image, right? And so we worked on that. She used hypnosis to try to take that out of the power out of that over me. We talked about power. So power was always an issue for me. Like I was a female engineer, right? I started as an engineer. So sorry guys, but I have always had a hard time with you guys. Men were just my nemesis, and they were always my bosses because I was an engineer, and then I became a pastor. Like, why am I putting myself around all these guys who have power over me? So it was a big problem for me. I would rebel, I was argumentative, I didn't want to, don't try and tell me what to do, who do you think you are? That doesn't work well in the ministry. And so, that's why I'm an ordained deacon and not an ordained elder. I work outside the church. But anyway, but that was my issue. It had nothing to do with them. I needed to work on the issue of power. One of my exercises that I did in therapy is I was asked to look up the word power everywhere you could find it in Scripture. It was a powerful experience, right? I did. I wrote down all of that word is in Scripture, both Old and New Testament, a whole bunch of times. And you know who is the noun is usually? If the action is being powerful, it's God, right? So I figured out, like, you know what? These guys don't have any power. God has all the power. So I was able to reimagine what power looked like, right? And power has to do with the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit loved me. So my prayer, my whole prayer life was for probably a decade, and you're going to think this is vain. I prayed for power all the time. I didn't pray for power to be abusive. I prayed for the power to do the work of God in the world in a significant way. I prayed that prayer like every day. I please God, give me power. I mean, it sounds vain, right? But it was, and honestly, God knew what I meant. And so I'm like, God, give me power. I want to have power within me of the Holy Spirit so I can be powerful in the world for the kingdom of God. And so that really began my journey, right? My journey was a long way to get healed. I buried it. I didn't even know what happened for 10 years. I went to a counselor, blew that counselor off, came home, got married, couldn't be intimate, let me just put it that way. And so I was it was a long journey. By this time, I'm like 45. That's not that long ago. And so, but I was a little younger than that, but so that was my journey. And then while I was on staff, things would happen. Like I remember one time, Steve Wendy, who was a former pastor here, he preached a sermon, and I was the director of outreach. I think I wasn't in seminary yet, or maybe I just started seminary, and he said the word rape in one of his sermons. And he had so many phone calls. He called me and said, Denise, do something. I'm like, oh, yeah, because I'm better, So I started something. I'm sorry, I apologize for this is my unprofessional, but I started a group where women, we just came and talked. We called it Sanctuary, and I held it up in a small chapel here before this building was a dream in anyone's eye. And we did it for 2 years, and then it was done after 2 years. And women would come up to me and they'd say, Denise, I've been in the parking lot the last 3 Wednesdays, but I couldn't come inside. It would take women several times before they could have the courage to come in. And I would say, I'm not a counselor. I always gave that quote. I'm not a counselor, I'm just a fellow person on the journey. And we just talked, and we talked about incest, and we talked about sexual abuse and assault and physical violence and lots of domestic violence victims. Women who sang in the choir, you wouldn't have known, women who were in my Bible study never knew they were victims of incest. And it was a powerful time. And so that was sort of an entry into it. I started a justice series, and so I got so involved in justice. I mean, it was here where all that was birthed, at university, where all those things grew up inside of me, where God gave me a voice. And I think God began to give me a powerful voice, right, for good, a powerful voice for advocacy. And so I began we started Child Abuse Prevention Task Force. We did justice lectures on human trafficking. We went to India. We went to the Philippines and did trafficking mission trips, if there is such a thing, right? I mean, we started doing all these sorts of things because God, the hypervigilance in me was just rocking and rolling, you know. I mean, I was like, what can I do for you, God, you know? And at the same time, I was healing from my own rape, you know. I began to speak about it all the time. I've spoken about rape in men's and women's Emmaus walks and Christmas walks. I've spoken at college campuses, you know. I say this story over and over again. I absolutely believe in the narrative, or trauma narratives, that when you say these things over and over again, they begin to have less and less power over you. It's like you spit it out a little bit at a time, so there's nothing left in there that has any power left over you, and that's how I heal. I still get a few of those things. I still have a few triggers. You know, I'm a little shaky. You know, I get like that sometimes. When I get ready to tell people my story, I still get a little unnerved. But you know, God has taken that experience and we're supposed to talk about thriving, and I've thrived. And then in the middle of it, when I was in seminary, at the end of my seminary year, and I was trying to figure out whether I wanted to be an elder in the church or a deacon, if you don't know what that is, whether I wanted to be helping lead a local church or I wanted to be in the community serving the world as a representative of God. I struggled for 7 years. When I finally told the board of ordained ministry I want to be a deacon, they're like, Jesus, thank you. So, I'm waiting for those words to come out of your mouth. Okay, well, let's get on the road and do it. And so that's what I do. And then in the middle of chapel, God said to me, I want you to start a women's shelter. I'm like, no, I don't know anything about that, you know. And in the meantime, I met this nun, and I was working at a lot of domestic violence shelters here in San Antonio doing spiritual formation. Long after I finished all my counseling work, I was much healthier at that time. And God wouldn't let me go. And one time I started saying it to Bible studies, right? I was teaching a bunch of Bible studies here at the university, and I started saying it out loud. And I think this one guy got sick of hearing me saying it. He was a pretty rich guy. His name was Bill Worth. And he came, Denise, here's $10,000. Start the darn shelter. We started making a rent house. And we got a task force, and the people just came out of the woodwork to help the women's ministry. I started telling people, and one day, I don't know if you all know Martha Etter. She's a major in church. One day, Martha Etter came up to me. She goes, I want you to give a witness in church. This was a few years, my order's up a little wrong. A few years early, Martha had come up to me and said, I want you to give a witness in church about UMW or something, about women's ministry. And so when I was praying about what I was going to say, all I could think about was this rape, right? This is sort of in the middle of my counseling stuff. And my husband still didn't really know much. And I knew I was going to say this out loud in the church before like 3,000 or 4,000 people. And I had to tell my husband. And I did leave a little bit of that out, so I told my husband. So Martha Etter and I, we were good friends. We'd become dear friends. And then one day, after I'd started whispering about women's shelter, we should open a women's shelter, we should open a women's shelter, we should stop having potlucks, we should open a women's shelter. One day Martha Etter comes, she goes, Denise, you know what? We should open a women's shelter. And so I added $10,000. I was like, we're opening a women's shelter at the university. And that's how Magdalena House was born. And so I think that God did do something amazing. God had nothing to do with my rape. You know that, right? But God had everything to do with walking through the journey with me. Even though I was stubborn and hard-headed, it took me a long time to get there. God still celebrated me. And so I'm here to say it can be done. You can get through that stuff. It's awful, you know. I can conjure up an image that has absolutely no power over me at all. You know, it was before I sort of fall apart. You know, I talk about rape. I speak at college camp. I just spoke at SAC. You know, the hashtag Me Too. I mean, you know, I can give you stats all day long with the severity of rape in the world. I mean, it's pretty amazing. I think since I read a stat the other day, since 1998, 17,700,000 women have been raped. One every 98 seconds. That's 570 women a day are raped. 3% of rapes are men. Don't get me wrong. When I speak at men's Emmaus groups, I have 2 to 3 men walk up to me and tell me about a rape that they had. Sometimes they'll walk up and tell me about the rape that their daughter experienced or their wife experienced and how it's completely turned their family upside down. Women's Emmaus, I've never spoken about it and not had a girl come up and talk to me about it. When I spoke at SAC just the other day, I did an impromptu survey, and obviously it was a stacked room because it was a hashtag sexual assault topic. You know, they call it hot potato, and the statistics were unbelievable. Again, the room was not representative. Women came to and men from that college campus can't even talk about that, sexual harassment and all that, and as well as sexual assault. But God can do amazing things, and I'm proof.
Let me do something a little unusual. Let me invite you into a moment of silence. Just a moment of silence to thank God for Denise and to let God let what you heard sink into you. Amen. I don't have a lot more to say, but I do have a few things to say. First of all, I want you to know that there are people in a room down the hall praying for us in this room, for God to move among us, for healing and hope. Those people are going to be there when we end. If anybody wants to have a time of prayer with people that are dedicated to pray for you, they're down the hall, and I will show you where they are when we finish. 2 points I want to bring up from Denise's story, and then we'll open it for question. One is wounds can be redeemed. That is incarnation of wounds, God's power to redeem wounds. And I kept hearing the scripture that we say at almost every funeral. God will say, behold, I can make all things new. That's in the book of Revelation. That's the power of God. And that's so clear in Denise's life. She said something flippantly that I'm going to say out loud and give a little bit more weight to. She said, you know that God had nothing to do with the rape, right? But God had everything to do with the healing. I'm going to say that again. You know that God had nothing to do with the trauma. God had nothing to do with the abuse that you suffered in your childhood. God had nothing to do with the abuse you suffered in combat. God had nothing to do with the things that wrecked your life. Whatever that is. But God has everything to do with remaking you and rebuilding you and speaking promise and truth and hope into your heart and into your soul and into your life. Bad things happen. We live in a fallen world. We are not in the Garden of Eden. Sin, evil, and darkness are real. But they have no power.
Amen.
They have no power in the face of a God who created all that is, all that was, all that will ever be. They have no power in the face of the one who reached into the tomb of Jesus Christ and brought life out of death. So if you're here today and you have a story that hasn't been fully redeemed yet, if you're here tonight and you've got a story that death seems to have more power over you than life, we have a Jesus that has a different thing to say to you. And it's my honor, my privilege, my call to help connect you to that. It is the call of all these clinicians to help you find the resources you need to find the people to talk to therapeutically. But we've got to keep talking about this so that the stories don't become silent and haunt us. So that's all I'm going to talk about in terms of theology. And I have about 10 minutes in our schedule to give you time to ask questions of anybody up here, and Steve is back as our church counselor. You can ask any question and we'll do our best to answer them. Then we'll end, and there'll be a time for you if you want to come up for one-on-one questions. So any questions, any comments that anybody wants to raise tonight? Yes, sir.
My name is George Walker. I'm a 32-year Army veteran, and the thing that happened to you when you was a young girl, are you completely healed from that incident? Are you still having, memories and things like that that causes conflict in how you believe?
No, there's no conflict in how I believe. There are times I think I have a little bit of a hypervigilance about me. I'm always aware of my surroundings. But I would say the incident has no power over me whatsoever anymore. Absolutely not. And my belief system has grown and strengthened because I now take that same belief and work with other women and children who have experienced it. And it's through that power of God that they too are.
So what would you say to a lot of the individuals that's in this room that's, you know, dealing with trauma, something that happened in their lives, you know, that are afraid to go out, you know, that are afraid to share, you know, like you're sharing it, and that is dealing with traumatic things that have happened to them. What kind of advice would you give to those individuals that are in here that would help them to move forward in their life?
Well, you know, the first time I said it out loud, I was in a very small group of people, about 3 people, and so it was a very safe place. And I had begun counseling. I took a chunk of time out of my life, finally, 20 years later, and worked only on me. I finally said, I'm going to work on me. I work with mental health professionals. I work with a spiritual director. And I spend a lot of time in prayer. But when I finally was able to say it the first time out loud, it wasn't even to my husband. It was to these 4 women that I was in a Bible study with. I said it out loud. I remember just saying, I was raped, you know. And so that was so liberating, you know. And I think there has to be a place where you say it out loud. That's my own personal experience. And it has to be a place that's safe. And then suddenly, you're just not by yourself anymore.
And I would like to follow into that, if you don't mind. I think that's a big job of the church, is to create places where people can be in a group of 3 to 4 or 5 or 6 or 1 or 2, whatever it is, where people can begin to feel safe enough that they're going to be loved regardless of whatever's happened to them. So we've been talking some in the last few weeks about our biggest fears that will be that if we're completely known, if we're fully known, we won't be fully loved. And the church's witness to that is we want to know all of you, and we're going to love you. So that's part. I think that's well said. And I would say a huge thing that I heard in your story, Denise, is how God pursued you even when you did not want God. You did not want to go to counseling. Yeah, I'll do it. Yeah, I'll do it. Yeah, I'll do it. And God did not let go of you. And so that God's not going to let go of any of you. We just got to help you find the ways to turn around and go into the therapeutic relationships that are around you. Others, questions, comments?
It's sort of a follow-up to that is, how do we encourage? How do we support those people who we know that need to be in a therapeutic situation and who are doing a Denise and saying that I'll get around to it, I'll go after this is over, or, that sort of thing.
Any professionals want to take that? I have a few thoughts. I'll start and y'all can jump in if you want.
I think on that.
I think as a church, we've got to love them anyway, and we got to know we can't fix anybody, right?
Yes.
So that's part of what the church has done and society has done that's not so helpful is that we kind of become, we try to be the savior. Let us fix it. We can't fix that. There's no fixing that except for Denise being ready to respond. I think a witness of prayer is huge. To be praying for anybody that's suffering and hurting and hasn't named it yet. You don't have to know that. So I think there's a real witness and a real place for prayer to bring people. But I want to be real clear. We're going to talk a lot about this next week when we talk about addiction and substance abuse. There's nothing that you can do as an individual to fix another individual.
You can help plant seeds. Sometimes they'll finally connect the dots. You can love them. You can show them the postings. These talks are all going to be on the website. You could share what you've seen with a loved one. Let them see it. Sometimes you don't know when someone's going to be touched and say, aha, that's me. You know, I have that issue. I know what that's like. You can offer to go with them to a support or recovery group if they're willing to go, without any expectation of change other than just let's go. And I love you, and let's do it together. But you can't make somebody seek treatment unless they're ready to do it. And you have to be ready.
Yes.
Hey, piggybacking off of that, that's, if you look at it, that's also part of the avoidance of the whole issue.
Yes.
If I have to go, then I'm gonna have to face it and feel all of those things that I've spent 30 years running from. Sign me up for that.
Right.
Nobody really wants to do that, and that's I think part of the struggle, is
Good point.
you do have to feel that.
Yeah, there is a real, a very big reality that we as do-gooding, Jesus-loving Christians have a hard time handling. And that is sometimes the pain has to be great enough that we will choose something different than we've always done. And I heard that in
Yeah,
your story.
for me, you know, I was at a point where I knew I wanted to serve God, and I knew that I couldn't serve God in that state of mind. Not that a calling that I felt that I should answer, and so it was critical that I, you know, physician heal myself. That I didn't heal myself, God did. And mental health professionals and spiritual directors played a big role.
So I want to lift that up again. Mental health professionals and pastors. So there's a very big difference, and when the two work together, it is dynamic, which is part of what we're just stepping into here at university, having Steve Welch on staff as a church counselor, and us beginning to do some work together with pastoral care and mental health and spiritual formation all at the same time. So, okay, somebody else back there had a question.
Actually, my question does run into that. You're saying that the church, pastor and
Counselor?
counselor, yeah, they're two totally different entities. So when you're deciding or trying to encourage others to go and seek this help, you have the counselors, and it becomes a monetary issue.
Yes, we can talk more about that. Steve, you want to say anything into that conversation?
About,
The monetary stuff and
as far as what we do here,
Uh-huh.
and as far as my work here,
Yeah.
well, I am exclusively, in other words, I don't work at other places. I have the opportunity to work part-time here. And if you come and see me, there is a fee, and I charge a fee of $50 a session. But because of the church's generosity, we're able to reduce that further if you have a need. So we are at our church trying to fill a need, because we know it's difficult for folks, because most of us live at the edge of our financial resources.
Yeah.
And so it's a difficult thing, but certainly come and talk to us. And also, there are other resources in the city that are available for a low cost. So it's something that we can talk about.
Yeah, and so we're committed here at university, we're kind of figuring out, and that's part of what this team has been beginning to talk about, is we feel strongly that we've got to have ways for people to access mental health care that they can afford and sustain, along with the spiritual health stuff that we're creating and talking about with this very kind of event. So I actually think, Sherry, that kind of feeds into your question too, is that we keep talking about it. And that we as a congregation put a value toward making sure that people are able to access the kind of care that they need in ways that can make a difference in their lives.
Holly?
Yes.
So point out to people, so the mental health resource booklet that we put together in the back has, there's a group of mental health clinics in San Antonio that charge people based on their ability to pay, and they're indicated in there.
Yes, this is perhaps the best work of the whole mental health initiative team, is this book of resources, and please pick it up. But also know that we here at the church are going to work to refer you where you need to go that meets the needs that you have financially and where you are. Okay, other questions? We've got maybe time for one or two more. Yes.
This has come up in my head since the discussion and the statistics on rape victims. I have a granddaughter who's turning 11, and my grandchildren, of course, have been sheltered from the bad things that happen in the world. They happen in the world. At what, and this is not my job, it's a parent's job, but at what point do you, and how do you bring that in without traumatizing? Because she's very sensitive about things. How do you bring that in to prepare her without traumatizing her?
So it's a great question, and it's one that I think has got several different pieces to it. Let me answer one piece of it right now, and we talked about this a little bit last week. If we are a congregation that has a high number of people that are dealing with trauma, like we've talked about today, from all kinds of different areas, and we are a congregation that has a high amount of people that are adult survivors of child abuse, then we have to figure out something that's effective and healthy in how we talk to our children about their bodies and about sex. And I think about violence and the bad things that happen in the world too. We'll have something that speaks to that in the springtime, for sure. You will be seeing us creating something from the ministry of the church that helps parents and grandparents talk to their children about things like this, and even things like school shootings and kids that are watching the news, all those things. We've got to figure out the ways that we talk to our children about what Denise said so flippantly and so rightly.
Yeah.
You know that God wasn't involved in the rape, right? But God was involved in everything that brought. That's the story we've got to tell to our children, and we need some help from professionals to help us figure out how we say that. But that's an issue that's coming up more and more and more. So hang on. Hold your horses if you can, and if you can, let me get you to talk to some of these professionals one-on-one.
Well, I personally am ready to put it in front of the garage, but
Okay.
it's not my side of the road.
I think that we have to be more comfortable as adults to have frank talks with young people about their bodies, about sexuality, about boundaries, about I love me, I'm special, I'm not going to make these choices. We have to talk about it when they're very young.
That's part of what's on the table when we look at the
Good.
whole curriculum that we want, or the whole programming that we want to do is how you talk age appropriately. From
Yes.
little bitty on, from 2-year-olds on up. And we as a church need to do that. So I don't know that, we're going to get there. It's on our radar. Yeah. I think we've got time for one more question, and then we're going to break up for those who want to speak one-on-one later. Yes, Jeanette.
Okay. How do you handle a situation when a child has been abused by a peer and molested, and then they come in and they tell a parent or they tell someone at church, or it comes out over time, but they don't want help? How, and then they become of legal age, and the parent can't say, well, you need to go, or the grandparent or whoever.
I think that's Sherry's question as well, is how do you help people who aren't ready to access that help? And it's a hard one. It's a hard one. I, again, will not underestimate the power of prayer to lift that person up, and for us to know that God's intervention is probably better than any intervention that we can make happen. But we got to keep talking about it. So the church cannot be another place in the world that someone who has gone through these kinds of things can easily avoid telling the truth. So I started out tonight by saying, God, help us to hear the truth in a way that will set us free.
Yes.
We've got to be a congregation and a people that can tell the truth about our lives, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and know that through that truth we will be made free. Where we're kind of programmed in the world, and even, I think it's part of our sinful nature that when bad things happen, what we want to do is bury them. We don't want to talk. We don't want to deal with it. And that's part of our instinct and intuition. And I think we've got to just completely rewrite the script there. And I don't know exactly how to do that in a way that's the most helpful, but I think we're giving it a good shot. So, okay, I want to make sure we've got time for those of you who want to come up and visit one-on-one to do that. Denise will be up here, the mental health professionals, the mental health initiative team will be here. There are people waiting to pray with you down the hall if you need that. I know. Next weekend we're going to talk about addiction and substance abuse. I invite you to be a part of that. I know that a lot of times that goes hand in hand with trauma. A lot of times that goes hand in hand with surviving abuse. So come and listen to that. October 7th is a Sunday, and that Sunday we will have a lunch that day called Continuing the Conversation. These Wednesday nights are called Starting the Conversation, and once we make it through all of our Wednesday topics, then we're going to start meeting once a month on something called Continuing the Conversation. You'll see more about that. We just invite you to come have lunch with us, this team of folk, and just keep talking so we can discover more ways that we need to be at work and following where God's leading us. So let me invite you, if you would, grab somebody's hand if you're okay with touching someone else. If you're not, that's okay. Thank you, Margie. Thank you. That's what was in my mind. You read my mind. Before I pray with you, there's also a ministry called Stephen Ministry that is a lay, one-on-one way that we pair women with women and men with men to help you walk through some difficult times. If you're interested in knowing more about that, come talk to me at the end, but let us pray now. Lord, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for being a power in this world that can defeat any enemy, whether that is the way that we think or the things that have happened to us. You can defeat all those enemies. Your power is the greatest. So thank you for the power that was in Denise tonight. Thank you for your power that healed her and redeems her and continues to do that. Let everyone in this room leave here knowing that's their promise too. That you are a God of new beginnings. That you can take the things that have happened to us in our lives and that you can make us more than that. And that you can use those things to help us know you better and to help us serve you. We love you. We thank you. We pray for any in this room that leave here hurting tonight or afraid or scared. Help us as a church be a place where they can continue to talk and continue to find your truth. It's in the powerful name of Jesus that we